Another issue with the CPI is the quality bias. This occurs when the Bureau of Labor Statistics inaccurately records price changes, but the quality of the product has changed. Let's say you're buying new tires and you're paying 50% more than you would have paid last year. Well, that looks like inflation. Problem is, what if those tires are 50% better? Well, then really, per quality unit, the price of tires hasn't changed. We don't want to just measure higher prices and call it inflation. We want to measure higher prices when there's no change in the quality of the product. That's what inflation is designed to tell us. The Bureau of Labor Statistics does attempt to control for this issue, and they use a process called hedonics. In essence, they try to assess how much of the increased price is due to higher quality and how much is due to simply inflation. Then there's the new product bias. Remember, the Consumer Price Index uses a fixed basket over time, and new products come out and often replace older products. To the extent they don't incorporate these new products, they're not really representing the typical household. Example, for a long time, people were still using landline phones, and they were in the CPI, and it was accurately measuring telecommunications. But then people stopped using those and replaced them with cellular technology, eventually today using the smartphone. Well, to the extent the Bureau of Labor Statistics keeps the landline in there, they're showing how much prices are changing for landlines, but people aren't using landlines anymore. They're using smartphones. So they have to deal with this, and that means every couple of years they do introduce new products and substitute them for old ones. Now that may sound like it's changing the basket and undermining our assessment of higher prices, because if we want to measure higher prices, we don't want to change the basket. But if you think about it, while they are changing a specific product, the larger objective of that product is not. For example, the fact that we don't use landlines anymore but do use cell phones and smartphones, well, we're still engaging in telecommunications. That's the bigger product that's being measured here. So they can do these substitutions as long as they are sticking with the overarching product goal. Each of these biases can cause a deviation between the inflation rate that households are witnessing and what is being reported by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So far, I've identified these as causing a deviation where the household feels a lower inflation rate than what is actually being reported. In essence, assuming that they're over-reporting inflation. But it can work the other way around. It's possible, for example, that households aren't substituting more expensive products for cheaper ones, but because of diminished options, they're forced to substitute cheaper goods for more expensive ones. Perhaps your local grocery store stopped offering canned tuna, so now you're forced to buy fresh tuna. You went from cheaper to more expensive. If the Bureau of Labor Statistics still thinks you're buying canned tuna, they're going to underreport the inflation that you're experiencing. Similarly, it's possible that a particular outlet in your area that was cheaper is gone, and you're forced to shop at a more expensive one. The 99-cent store goes out of business in your area, and so you have to shop at Vons. If the BLS records that you're still shopping at the 99-cent store, they're going to underestimate your inflation rate. Quality bias is one that is very prone to causing inflation to be underreported. Why? Because sometimes when firms are having to raise the price of their product, they cut the quality as an alternative. You might have experienced this with potato chips. You open up a bag of potato chips, and even though you paid the same price, the quality actually went down. There's more air than there are chips. To the extent the Bureau of Labor Statistics doesn't record that lower quality, then they're going to show less inflation than what you're actually experiencing. You're paying more per chip. They just fail to see it. And with the new product bias, it's possible that the new product is more expensive than the old product. And because they haven't included the new product in the basket, they're underreporting the inflation you're experiencing. This happened years ago when cars went from being manual stick-shift transmission to automatic. Automatic cars were more expensive than manual cars, but they were recording that people were still buying manual cars when many people had switched. So they were underreporting inflation because they weren't considering that people were having to buy automatic cars. There are other price level indexes that we can build. We looked at the Consumer Price Index. That's the big one. That's the one that hits the headlines every month. But some other ones that are important include the Producer Price Index. This is also compiled by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The difference is it's really looking at what businesses are buying as opposed to households. So the market basket includes final goods as well as intermediate goods, because businesses buy both. You could have a company like McDonald's that they buy shelving for the back office or a new computer for the back office. That's a final good. But they may also buy meat that they're going to turn into burgers that they're going to sell to you. That's an intermediate good for them. So you get both this final and intermediate good inclusion in the Producer Price Index. The real value here is it becomes a leading indicator of the Consumer Price Index. If, for example, hamburger meat is becoming more expensive for businesses, then there's a good chance at some point in the future the CPI is going to show higher priced hamburgers for consumers. So it gives us insight into what's coming for the consumer down the road. The Employee Cost Index is somewhat similar to the PPI. It's compiled by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but what it's looking at is a specific cost for businesses. That is the cost of employee labor costs. And these are going to include the cost of wages, obviously, but also the cost of fringe benefits and salaries and anything that's related to labor. If it becomes more expensive for a business like McDonald's to hire labor, then we would expect the Employee Cost Index to go up. And that tells us what's probably coming in the future for the Consumer Price Index. Those burgers are eventually going to be more expensive for the consumer. So both these have a similar purpose, that is to help predict what's going to happen to the CPI in the future. The GDP deflator, this one is compiled by a different organization, the Bureau of Economic Analysis. This is the same organization that compiles GDP. As a result, this is looking at GDP as our basket. So instead of creating a hypothetical basket that represents consumers or producers, here we actually use the total GDP in the economy as the market basket. Now, there's an advantage there in that it's more inclusive of all aspects of the economy. Recall, in gross domestic product, we not only have household purchases, we call that consumption, but we also have business purchases, firm purchases, we call that investment. We also have government purchases. And we have purchases from the rest of the world, exports. So GDP is going to include consumption, investment, government spending, as well as exports. That's the upside. It's a broader basket. The downside is it doesn't represent the typical household or business very well. For example, if the price of jet fuel goes up, that's going to affect the government because they have a lot of jets for military purposes, but it's not going to affect the average household. So the GDP deflator would go up, but it wouldn't mean much for the typical household because we don't buy jet fuel. If the price of tractors went up for residential construction companies, they buy tractors. That's an investment good. So that's going to show up as inflation in the GDP deflator. But the average household doesn't buy tractors, so it wouldn't have much meaning. The Personal Consumption Expenditures Index is also compiled by the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and this helps deal with the issues of the deflator. Remember, it includes consumption, investment, government spending, and exports, why not just strip out from the GDP basket everything but consumption and look solely at that, which makes up 2/3 of all of GDP. So it's actually a pretty broad basket in and of itself. And then that basket can be used as a proxy for what households are buying. So in that case, only if a household is buying the good is it going to show up in the PCE. Interestingly, even though the Consumer Price Index is the mainstream, most commonly reported measure of inflation, from the government standpoint, when they're looking at their policies and dealing with inflation in the economy, they almost always use the PCE. So in either case, you're getting an assessment of what households are experiencing in terms of higher prices. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is, regardless of the index we create, the formula doesn't change. This is the formula we saw in a prior video on how to calculate the Consumer Price Index. It doesn't matter. The only thing that's changing here is the basket that you're using. It's a different market basket, but you're still finding the expenditures in the current period, dividing it by the expenditures in the base period, and multiplying by 100 to get that index. Now that we know how we can measure inflation, let's identify how price level changes across time. That is, what the inflation rates are across time. To do this, we're going to use a basic percentage computation formula. Later year index minus the earlier year index in our numerator, divided by the earlier year index in our denominator. Multiply that by 100. Let's do some examples. Let's imagine that in 2002, we have 100 as our index. And again, it doesn't matter which measurement we're using. 2003, we have 110, and then 2004, we have 125. Let's calculate the inflation rate from 02 to 03. Using this formula, our later year index is going to be 2003, which is 110. We're going to subtract from that the earlier year index, which is 100, and divide that by the earlier year index, which is 100. And you can multiply by 100. And that is 10 over 100, which is 0.1, times 100 is 10%. For the next one, we want to go from 02 to 04, 10% here. In 02, we have a index of 100, and then it goes to 125 in 04. So the later index is 125, and we subtract the earlier year index of 100, and divide that by 100, times 100. So 125 minus 100 is 25, divided by 100 is 0.25. Multiply that by 100 is 25%. Now you'll notice that you really didn't need to use this formula to get the answer, because you could have just said 110 minus 100 is 10%, or 125 minus 100 is 25%. And you can always do that when you're comparing a later year to the base year. Just subtract 100 and you'll get the correct inflation rate. But when you're comparing years outside the base year, you can't do that. Here we're comparing 2003 to 04. So what we want to do is use this formula, and again, we can take 04, which is the later year, 125, minus 03, which is the earlier year of 110, divided by earlier year of 110 times 100 equals, so I'm going to need a calculator for this. Take 125 minus 110, that's 15 divided by 110 times 100 equals 13.6%. So if your instincts were telling you, well, 03 to 04, that's 110 to 125, that's a 15% change. It's not, because you're going from 110 to 125. That's a 13.6% change. So the result is inflation in every single period. These are hypothetical numbers. We'll look at the real ones soon.